When the cell phone and the internet was unplugged from Gaza at the end of October by Israel's Unit 8200, I imagined for Palestinians their spooky radio silence must have been suffocating. So I called a friend in Lebanon to find out if he'd heard anything of Maurice, who has a little hotel down by the beach, not far from Khan Yunis. As it happened, the internet was plugged back the next day, and by the time I got through, I realised Hamas had won the war against Israel. For outsiders, it might appear that Hamas has triggered its own destruction by committing unspeakable atrocities against Israeli civilians. Surely it was utter madness to break out of Gaza on October 7th and kill, torture, kidnap and burn the peaceful people of nearby towns. Yet it was carefully planned madness, if so, with impressive coordination and astounding secrecy. Within a week, Israel's army and the reservists were marshalled at the border fence. Precision bombs had pummeled Gaza City. The scene was set for a ground invasion to hunt down the thousands of Hamas fighters and their leaders, mostly hidden in the maze of tunnels built under the Strip. But was that really the plan? Not quite. The quickly adopted strategy was to bomb the tunnel network to make it a complete ruin, flash Hamas to the surface, and bomb some more. But that first plan was set aside. A fierce backlash formed as soon as the civilian casualty videos went to air. Initially, thoughts of rescuing the hostages was quietly set aside. After all, the chances of their being found and surviving, even with, 100 commando team operations, is pretty low. For Israel to fight their way to tunnel entrances overland and then dig them out would be massively costly. Hamas had built a trap in the densely built streets. Every block holds snipers and explosives. The massive tunnel drop bombing was replaced by targeted strikes, yet even those came at a price. Time was never on their side, and world sympathy is running dry as pictures of maimed children flood the evening news bulletins. As it is, Israeli leadership is bickering and seen as incompetent, so far from the days when they were feared and respected. After weeks of delay, a ground offensive began. As we all know, Israel depends on the United States for support. The US president and politicians cannot be seen to give unconditional support to what is shown as an Israeli slaughter of the innocents, made worse by an almost pointless blockade of supplies to the Strip. Even though Israel is operationally considerate of Palestinian civilians, there are limits when your enemy is completely embedded throughout the civilian population. With Hamas facilities built under the hospitals and schools, the choice is steam in and kill or hold back and lose. Lose the press battle. We are in an age of instant video with a very reactive public mind. Past conflicts never got this kind of scrutiny. Imagine, say, news crews appearing with live feeds after the bombing of Dresden in World War II, showing children buried in the rubble. Or video journalists in Tokyo on the morning of, the 11th of March in 1945, following the incendiary firebombing raids that destroyed 16 square miles of the city, killing 100,000 people, leaving 1 million homeless in just 2 nights. 20,000 children burned alive. Tokyo, 45. Conducting such tactics today would be unthinkable and political suicide for any Western or even Eastern politician. Even so, given the Gazan population of 2 million, the death count of 10,000 in a month is certainly a mid-war by any comparison. Israel has cancelled many strikes because of close civilian contact. Here, Hamas gather children at a rocket launch site nearby because they know Israeli drones are watching. If they launch without interference, they win. If the IDF kill the terrified children, they win still. Wars today hinge not on what you can unleash, but on what you can justify before the cameras. Look at Tokyo closely again. You can see this is by fire. That wasn't an issue at the time, of course. America is forcing Israel to allow in supplies in very limited amounts, but the US threat of withholding funds altogether is frankly empty. America needs a strong Israel in the Middle East, regardless of the force used. As I see it, as I hear it, Israel has lost and Hamas has won. I'm taking the criminal perspective, where every player is ruthless and entirely self-interested. And when it comes to humanity, that's usually a safe bet. What seems absurd on top of this devastating clash is that those of us watching from the West have a completely naive understanding of the reality on the ground. Even the idea that there is a country called Palestine is really a fantasy, and the 2 million Gazans of the Strip, mostly from the country of, well, we'll call it refugee land, a country with states around the world but no homeland. The parents of the children in Gaza today were mostly born in a virtually stateless condition with a Palestinian Authority passport, if any at all, and that's more of an identity document than a real passport. And their grandparents, well, it's kind of tangled up, so I'll keep this brief. But it will be useful to know. Before World War I, the area we are talking about was one of the Ottoman Empire's 36 provinces, attached to the Syrian district but ruled directly from Constantinople. I'd put up maps, but the maps don't help. Every mapmaker for the last 150 years has political, religious, or military motivations. The French had one of their own that told a story. During the war, every player had their map, but the only place you'd see a full Palestine is in those old pretty maps of the Holy Lands. My first Bible had that. You know, there's trouble when you see Holy Lands taking as maps. The area of interest was never an independent state, and when the Allies won that war, World War I, the Middle East was divided amongst the winners and their friends. The French made Lebanon, much of Syria, while the British took the Palestinian Mandate, using the name the Romans used during their empire. And the biblical name stuck, Palestine. Some Jews, of course, had always lived there. There was an old Jewish section of Gaza. But the idea of a Jewish homeland took hold and was encouraged sometimes by the British, with reversals. Jews emigrated there to avoid persecution, bought land, formed the group kibbutz farms. Keep in mind that before 1900, people did not identify much in that area other than the town or village of their families. The Muslim Arabs spoke of themselves as Gazans, of course, Jerusalemites, or from Hebron, or the coastal ports, the place, not as Palestinians. There were some fights and killings between Arabs and Jews, and nothing major. Money was raised as the dream of a homeland went on, but to buy that land for Jewish settlements. When talk of a homeland looked like becoming real, Jerusalem Arab nobles encouraged trouble. The number of wealthy Arabs did not want any change to their position, and both a Jewish homeland and some new Palestinian state would affect their power, so any change from the Ottoman structure was shunned. Looking at the battles and killings of the 1920s and 1930s, I'd have to say the Arabs killed more and certainly were stirred more easily. But the Jews had their armed fighters too, Haganah it was, and famously blew up the British administration headquarters at the King David Hotel. They did phone in a warning, which was promptly ignored by the Brit commander, of course. The first Palestinian passport was actually issued by the British, and they issued banknotes too. Now, you know there's going to be trouble when somebody clawing for identity has passports and money printed. We have quite a bit to answer for on the optics. Only after World War II did the United Nations agree to form Israel. A ragged bite out of the coast was a partition plan. That was 1947. The British mandate ended on the 14th of May, 1948. And the next morning, Arab armies from Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Iraq attacked. Most of the non-combatant Arabs living within the area were told to flee by their religious leaders, particularly Amin al-Husseini, aristocratic Jerusalemite, appointed Grand Mufti by the British, later Berlin resident and propagandist for Hitler. Many Arabs who ignored his, long-distance order to flee, which was a powerful instinct for the MAF, stayed and later became Israeli citizens. The Arab coalition lost that war, and the others that followed too. Keep in mind that those countries that attacked the new Israel had no plans to make a country called Palestine. They certainly would have turned on each other over Jerusalem, which had special arrangements. It always has. During the war, during any war, people are uprooted, move and often take up a new life elsewhere. Millions did so in Europe, usually happy in their new lives. For the Palestinians, it has been different. Their leaders don't want the problem solved. Mostly, they just want the Jews dead. Did the Jews steal the land? Rarely. It was usually bought or traded for. As for the conflicts, the new state of Israel offered treaties with all the surrounding lands, yet all peace offerings were rebuffed. After that first Arab-Israeli war, the Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt, which again had no intention of creating an independent Palestine. In 1967, Israel was attacked again, and this time Israel took control of Gaza. I could go on and on about this, but the important thing is many times Israel has offered terms of settlement, always been rejected. Many times the surrounding countries have attacked without warning, but they lost. None of the surrounding countries will accept Palestinians willingly. The Gaza West Bank government, called the Palestinian Authority, up until Hamas came in Gaza, they issue a passport, but it's only accepted for travel purposes. It's not recognised as citizenship of a country. Except almost no country, especially nearby Muslim lands, allow easy travel anyway. Refugees have been forced on Jordan, Lebanon and elsewhere, but never assimilated into those countries. The Arab world doesn't want them, sad as it is. The twisted logic is that if they accept them as refugees, it's like saying they have no rightful home. Yet the Arab nations mostly don't have standard diplomatic relations with this imagined Palestine. And they don't actually like them much either. Besides, that's the last thing the Palestinians themselves want. If they went somewhere else, they would then just be ordinary citizens of another place. Politically, what do they want? Who knows? Every leader or government they've had only wants to destroy Israel. No plans for the Palestinians other than to, the usual, mismanage and steal the massive donations. There is even a separate and special UN agency just to fund Palestinians, formed in 1949 with 30,000 employees today and over $1 billion allocated each year. The Gaza Strip's economy was estimated at around $28 billion in 2021, with the United Nations agencies providing close to $4.5 billion to Gazan programs. The government of Qatar has provided $1.3 billion in aid and salary support to Gaza since, I think, 2012, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank committed to spending $1.7 billion, of somebody else's money, of course, in 2021, just in salary support to Palestinian civil servants who'd been kicked out of their jobs when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. So even Gazan former local civil servants still get paid. Palestinians in Gaza are the most well-funded refugees in the world, and good luck to them. Yeah, terrific. No wonder they don't want to leave for anywhere else. That's something few would give up, but it's a trap and a dead end in the end, despite the odd fact that they have a better income than most of the Arab world. Unemployment is high. They are stuck in an unproductive open prison with no chance of good government. Earlier in the year, Israel allowed over 100,000 Gazans to cross into Israel for day jobs, but they had to cross back each night. Yet Gaza is a very unique place. A third are Gazans, I suppose Egyptians really, if one of the many claims are valid, but 2/3 are official refugees from wars with Israel or bad advice they'd taken to run. But being a refugee is inherited there, now passed on for generations. There are 8 refugee camps, but they are not rows of tents, as there's been enough money from the UN to make semi-solid buildings. Jabalia camp has a few holes in it now. But everywhere in Gaza is or was in poor shape. There are good apartments to be had and houses around and some fine shops. Technically, just 1 in 10 large buildings have been bombed out so far, but it will get worse. Israeli publicists have been struggling to get over the bad press of the numbers of children killed in strikes. The figures are in large part down to the demographics of Gaza. Of the population, some 43% are children under 14. You compare that with Europe, which is about 15% children under 14. Now, why is that? It's not just the UN agency's huge support services allowing larger families. While most Western women have less than 2 children, Gazan women go for around 4 each. And again, why is that? Okay, less than 14% of women in Gaza have jobs. So it's not just having all that time at home, or the extra benefits Hamas gives for having babies. I think, might sound strange, but I think it's fashionable to have loads of kids there. A cute lifestyle competition amongst the women of Gaza. Perhaps now with some regrets? No, I don't think so. But the point is, if you have more kids running around, the more likely they can fall victim to bombs. Hamas really knows what to do with kids. Most of the soldiers of Hamas are just young guys who needed a job, and they're not true believers, not zealots. This Hamas soldier above, captured alive by the IDF, tells of the bonuses of his job. A new car for some certain number of killed Israelis, and even a new apartment if he brings back a hostage. I'm guessing that Hamas real estate prices, those real estate prices will have to keep. Regular viewers will catch the value of showing a Hamas soldier alive and, talking his head off. It gives the trooper some way out. Even so, Hamas runs the cell blocks inside Israeli prisons, so he can't go there. He can never go back to Gaza either. This one here admits his own dad would kill him anyway for what he did in killing the children. He'll get special treatment, all right, but he'll survive. You'll understand Gazans and West Bank Arab residents cannot be incorporated as citizens into Israel. Sure, there are already Arab Israeli citizens, but they're in the minority. Adding Gazans and others into the Israeli democracy would deliver a wrecking ball to Israel's already fractured political structure. A few weeks ago, I would have said, give it a couple of generations and things might settle. But not now. And what of the two-state solution? Independent Palestine, Israel together, next to each other? No. What would a Palestinian democracy look like? Look around the Middle East, the Arab Muslim world, and try to find a working, open government with rights for minorities and free speech. There isn't one. The Arab Spring of supposed people power only made fresh and lasting disasters. It's hard to believe France and the UK supported the downfall of Gaddafi in Libya. Here, pictured with new President Jalil. How long did Jalil last before the killing started? Was it 12 months? We're interfering imbeciles in the West. Gaddafi was actually famed for the man-made river project to green the desert. Got halfway through. We are known for the man-made river of blood. There is no arrangement that anyone will allow in some future peace as things stand. You can't create a peaceful democratic society from words and a guidebook. We are lucky to have the handful of democracies that we have. As for Israel, the days of making concessions for peace and its global sympathy have now crashed. It already had nutty ultra-Orthodox parties in government with messianic far-right settlers in the West Bank determined to take all they can all the way east to the west bank of the River Jordan if they could, and to depopulate Gaza in the south. A lot of those extremists are expat Americans, I noticed. I wonder how they would be feeling if they'd stayed at home given the anti-Jewish backlash in the US. Even more rabid, I suppose. Over the summer this year, Israel was making agreements and gaining acceptance with her Arab neighbours. Things were looking good for a wide cooperation agreement, treaties with Saudi Arabia, and so forward to almost all Arab nations in the Middle East. Well, other than Iran, of course. All that diplomatic progress has now stalled. This is exactly what Hamas wants, one of the key Hamas objectives behind the killings of October 7th. My call through to Ibrahim in Lebanon paid off. He'd not long spoken to Maurice, who had a chirpy iridium phone out on the beach, not far from, Khan Yunis. Ibrahim is a Maronite Christian who lives in a hilly country by the river that bears his name. Maurice had a Christian mother, but a misplaced bet by his father left them in Gaza. His guest house down there is now quite full. But business is good, reports Maurice, despite everything. Most of the country is still standing. The fuel blockade is worse, he says, because 90% of the drinkable water comes from electric desalination plants. That's why they need the fuel. He's put mist-gathering nets on his roof. I don't think they'll get much water. I'd known Maurice when he was a kid, even before, he became a Captagon runner through the tunnels. The tunnels were carved out for commercial reasons, for smuggling from Egypt. Everything and anything came through the tunnels, but it did have to be carried, walk on its own. It's heavy work, and porters like Maurice use Captagon pills, it's a kind of speed stimulant, to get through a shift. The synthetic amphetamine is cooked up in huge quantities by Syria, part of that government's revenue. Maurice has travelled much of the world, but started out with the traditional view. I really believed Israelis were some kind of monsters like aliens, he says. When he actually met Israeli army guys, his views changed. Anyone who speaks such polite Arabic can't be a real monster. That was his judgment. I don't know about politeness meaning very much at all. He is puzzled by the idea of calling Hamas terrorists. He's no real friend of Hamas and guesses they'll get around to shooting him when they've got the time. But Hamas is nothing like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. They might have the same brutality of method. They tortured their own. But Islamic State were outsiders imposing their will. Terrorists are usually foreigners to the places they go to kill and blow up. Hamas in Gaza are local Gazans. Terrorists are vocally devoted to a religious or political belief. They tax often at 100%, but they don't govern. Hamas is the elected government in Gaza. Well, that was 17 years ago. Don't expect any elections soon, but until now they had wide support. Separately, they have 13 seats in Lebanon's parliament, by the way, and many delegations throughout the region. Iran gives money and technical support for operations in depth. We might call them barbarous, but terrorists, I think we'll keep that word for something else, shan't we? They're mad as rattlesnakes, but careful in their way. And we can ask, if citizens of a place elect a government that goes to war without warning, are the citizens not to blame in any way? Yes, with protection as non-combatants, but so far the collateral damage they've suffered is less by number than the West's war operations have caused in most of our major wars. Let's move on. What the hell is Hamas up to, and why? Let's follow the money. Usually works. Hamas, as the government of Gaza, depends on limited tax revenue and major aid donations. Little Qatar has paid hundreds of millions for construction projects since 2014. Until May this year, it was paying $30 million per month in regular transfers for families, for fuel and electricity, and to help pay public sector wages. There had been some rockets fired from Gaza that month, not a large attack. When the rockets fell silent, for some time a deal was agreed where Qatar, again, would pay $500 million to Gaza via bank accounts operated by the Palestinian Authority. Remember the PA, based in Ramallah in the West Bank? That was once the government of Gaza, but was voted out in 2007. And when Hamas came in, they tossed out most of the Palestinian Authority's salaried workers. Hamas put in their own civil servants and now had 50,000 salaried workers to pay, as well as the ministries to run. They saw Israel as the force interfering with their payments. So those rockets back then were a misguided prompt to allow the money transfers. It got complicated. Of course, the banks feared sanctions when transferring money to Hamas. Any bank sanctioned is then out of the US dollar transfer loop. Banking can be a problem. Iran's Hezbollah in Lebanon received their wages in dollars. Hamas had other ways of getting money, mainly from Iran, but that was limited, and that was in cash, and the cash is Hamas's private stash, not to be spent on public service. They wanted the Qatari money. So a new scheme was devised where Qatar would be permitted to pay into a UN administrative account from where Gazans individually were to be given direct debit ATM cards. So the aid would go directly to the civilian needy, in theory. The cards would be issued only after Israel approved the names list, and they wanted to bypass the Hamas civil servants entirely. How would Hamas, big shots and military wing, get their hands on the money? And that was, it was never settled. By the 5th of September, Qatari payments even to Egypt, it was, I think it was 10 million or something, for fuel to the generators that supplemented Gaza's supply, had stopped completely. And by the way, why did tiny Qatar pay out over $1.5 billion since 2012 to Hamas in Gaza? And how come Qatar is number one in the hostage negotiation skill set? A Doha agreement with the Taliban, remember that? Ukrainian children released. Officers for groups banned from, every civilized nation. That $6 billion payment to Iran, Venezuela was mentioned. And they keep themselves busy in Qatar. I wonder if there's a connection with Qatar ending its 60-year membership in OPEC 5 years ago. It might be something you'd want to take a look into. So, Hamas was hurting, starved of funds in the last 6 months. But the 7th of October breakout and attack had been planned for a year. Well, so everybody seems to think. I believe not. Many of the elements, the paragliders, the drone bomblets onto Israeli transponder towers, have the touch of old ideas rushed through. Hamas saw that they were being sidelined, not paid by Qatar, of less importance in the world, and broke. They needed a bold and spectacular demonstration of their importance. It was Iran that had most to gain. Iran saw that if peace and alliances were formed between Israel and Saudi Arabs, Iran would be boxed in. In the last months, Iran secured the technicalities that meant Israel would never catch on to the Hamas breakout. The cover story went out that Hamas was working on a different plan. It was set for December 9th, the second day of Hanukkah. The deception required hints in telephone intercepts, but with Tier 2 Hamas functionaries. However, the extremity of the attacks, the desecration and violation of Israeli families, Iran insisted upon that, not because of a special personal hatred of Jews, but because this attack had to be so outrageous that Netanyahu and a shamed Israeli Secret Service would have no choice but to pursue immediate and complete retaliation and destruction. As it happened, the Israeli response has been delayed and nervous, but it's going ahead. More casualties. Hamas knew the value of hostages and is almost completely relying on that to allow them to avoid complete destruction. Iranian guarantees for the future convinced Hamas there would be life for Hamas after these violations. The Iranians, of course, were lying. Iran does not much care about Hamas, and Iran cares nothing for the residents of Gaza, only that they suffer, and suffer publicly, televised. They care only that Israel becomes a pariah among nations, that the chances of Israel being allied with the Saudis is smashed for a generation or more. Sure, the Saudis and other Arab states privately don't care about the collateral damage in pursuit of crushing Hamas, but the public stand will echo long into the night and won't easily be flipped. The most important goal was that Israeli command would be trapped, compelled to pound much of Gaza City to rubble before sending in ground troops. As the German army learned too late at Stalingrad, broken buildings make ideal defensive positions for the defenders. Yet Israel cannot flush the tunnels because of the hostages. It cannot risk more lives of its troops and reservists than is essential. The war will drag on. Hamas must remain selective as to the hostage releases, but continue with the old and children, the civilians, but never the soldiers they have. As for Iran, the job is done. Hamas has won the war that counts. As for Hamas on the ground, Iran will be pleased if the experienced leadership is destroyed over the next months, for it needs the next, more gullible generation of Hamas to trick, bribe and cajole. For those of us that look on, most will think much less of Israel. Even my own view from the criminal perspective is that one must allow the human shield, yield to the shield. The Escobars of the world, who happily shoot through granny and 2 kids to get to their enemy, do not last long in any society, surface or criminal. I would not shoot, even if it were my best chance with my worst enemy. There will come a time some other day for those prepared to think ahead and care little if it appears a retreat. When you think that's a matter of honourable thief to spare non-combatants, children, the weak, even if no one is watching? Not really. Shots to thin bodies are wildly defected, that's for sure. Full penetration is unlikely, and better if your enemy thinks you're soft. A last curiosity, the Gaza-Israel war so far, and in projections, is a small war by 21st century standards even, by which I mean the age of video war dissemination. 15,000 killed, 250 named captives. The Ukrainian war has over 10,000 civilian deaths also, but around 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers and something like 120,000 on the Russian side. And let's not forget Syria, at least 500,000 dead. Its most lasting video moments, chlorine gassing of children gasping in hospital corridors, bathed in a waxy shining sweat. Well, that to me was memorable. All the Daesh blowing up some rocks in Palmyra apparently came a close second in the public retention. Now, this next war I'll mention is a big one. But who can guess? I'm talking of the war in Yemen. 380,000 killed, 4 million displaced. Astonishing compared to the coverage in any video zone elsewhere. That's a proxy war too, funded by our friends in the Arab world. Yemen. So why is every moment of the Gazan conflict so watched? Great video coverage and clearly defined villains and victims. Well, clearly defined if you're a 5-year-old watching cartoons, that is. In the public mind, Yemen didn't deserve ratings. For us, they were all, well, as bad as each other. What were they? Houthis or Saudi-backed pro-government Hadi loyalists? I mean, who gives a toss? And the really big difference, the Jews are the villains now. God, that was a long time coming back, wasn't it? We had expended so much energetic sympathy after the rather smart-looking Schutzstaffel boys got caught stoking the fires, and felt fuzzy about kibbutznikim, despite those very odd shirt collars they wore. and had to admire backroom smarts after Munich, but really it was getting a bit much, exhausting being on one side. It's so much less stressful to go back to old-time Jew-hating. That's got legs. Feel better now? Feel better now, you know?